have just finished making these two super cute dresses, and in this video I wanted to share with you how you can take a simple pattern and add design elements to it, whether it's trims or fabrics, and take your dress up to a boutique level like these dresses. For both of these dresses I have used the Children's Corner April pattern. I will put a link to that below. And I have taken what is a simple dress and with the different trims and piping and other design elements have made just a couple changes to the pattern itself, which I will share. But it's more about helping you walk through the design process of choosing your trims and your fabrics and just how I go about that so that you will have the confidence to take your pattern and your fabric, other trims and piping and such, so that you can create your own boutique April. And you can also use these same techniques to design any other dress. So follow along with me and we will get going on designs that you can work out a special little April dress for the little princess in your life. As I've already mentioned, I made the two dresses that I've been showing from the Children's Corner April pattern. If you're not familiar with Children's Corner patterns, these are great patterns. They have really well written instructions, but what I like the most about them is that they fit properly. You're not going to get a huge oversized garment like you sometimes will end up when you sew with the Big Four patterns. Now, one of the differences with the Children's Corner pattern, if you've not used these, the difference between these and the Big Four patterns is Children's Corner patterns have a 1/4 inch seam allowance almost everywhere. Where the skirt's attached, there's usually a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but most of your seam allowances are going to be a 1/4 inch. So if you're accustomed to sewing with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, that's quite a difference. Sometimes you might want to add some seam allowance to that to help you ease into learning to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And so for that, I've got my pattern here. This pattern comes as a PDF or as a printed pattern, and I happen to purchase the PDF pattern. And what I wanted to show you is this little mini curve ruler. And there are also larger curved rulers that are made by the same company. You can get a set of all of these. But if you're not accustomed to working with a 1/4 inch, this is a 3/8 inch size. And say I was working with the 6-month size, I would place the edge of the ruler on the cutting line for the 6/8 inch, or for the 6-month size, draw in my line at the top here. Now if this cutting line would be a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and you can go around the pattern and add seam allowance that way if you were using that size pattern. So because I've cut mine out, that would be impossible here. But you get the idea. Now, I don't recommend a 5/8 inch seam allowance. That's really a large seam allowance for children's clothes. My preference is a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And to do that, you would take this 1/8 inch line, and you would align that 1/8 inch line with the seam allowance and draw the line in here. And then you find the right shape of the curve. So this inside curve here, you find the right shape of the curve, and you can add your 1/8 inch seam allowance and just slide around and find where the curve fits the armhole properly. And you can add. It's much easier to do it with these curved rulers than it is with a straight edge. And obviously when you get to straight portions, you can just use the straight portion of that. But that would add 1/8 inch so that you would start with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And these come in handy if you're doing other types of pattern drafting or altering patterns as well. So I'll include a link to those in case that's something of interest to you. So as I mentioned, I only have made 2 minor changes to the pattern. You can see in this pattern that the skirt is not real full, and that's nice for some styles, and it is a little more contemporary, I think, to have a less full skirt, but the request that I had was for a very twirly skirt. So instead of cutting the skirt width, the width that was mentioned in the pattern, on both dresses I cut a 42-inch wide skirt for both the skirt front and the skirt back. And that gives it lots of fullness, so you're going to have a huge twirl factor. That's just a random number that I picked because I know it gives a nice full skirt, and I made a size 5 and a size 7. If you were doing a small size, you wouldn't want to add that much, but just use your own judgment there, and you can add whatever you want to the width. The other change that I made, this is the pattern for the sleeve ruffle, but in order to add any type of trim, it's best not to have it on the fold line. I like to have the trim encased in a seam line. So I cut along the fold line here, and I taped the 2 pieces together to give one long length for the ruffle. And then I needed to cut 4 of these because you're going to sew 2 of them together along the 1/4 of an inch here. And I did not add a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance to this fold line because adding the rickrack in, it bumps it out that 1/4 of an inch. So you can see that just by adding the rickrack in, you're adding that 1/4 of an inch back to the arm ruffle. So I hope that makes sense to you. Something else that you can find to be very helpful when you're planning and designing your dress is to take a picture or do a screenshot of the line drawing on the pattern. That offers you a blank canvas to play with, and you can draw in your different ideas. You can even use colored pencils and color in the picture. And you can print off as many of these as you like and play with different ideas to come up with your dress design. I find this to be another helpful tool if you're having trouble visualizing just the fabrics and the trims. For the frog dress, this was the fabric combination that I ended up with, but I wanted to show you some of the other options that were auditioned for this, and any one of these different options would have resulted in an equally cute dress. It's just how I felt at the moment. So I'm going to set these aside. So the first part of a design process after you've chosen your pattern that you're going to work with is to choose your fabric. And in my case, I chose this cute frog fabric. This is a Kelly Reitzel print, and it may still be available. I'm not real sure about that because I've had that fabric for a while in my stash. Some of the other fabrics that I auditioned with it was the stripe, which I think looks great with it, but it wasn't speaking to me at the moment. Another one was this print, and again, it goes well, but it didn't excite me. It seemed a little bit too bright for the frogs, and I felt like that would take away from it. The other 2 options that were close runner-ups were these 2 polka dots, and either one of them would have worked very well for the outfit. In case you haven't guessed, I have a pretty enormous stash of just about everything, but I realize that everybody doesn't have a large stash, and if you don't, then you would be doing this type of planning at your fabric store. audition different fabrics, stack them up together the way quilters do. So some of the other options for the bodice on this dress that could have worked out quite as cute as what I ended up with is you could take a wide ribbon, and then on top of that you could put a narrower ribbon, and the polka dots go really well, which if I had selected one of these fabrics, I would have gone with the center much like this with the polka dots, because I feel like that pulls it all together. And then it would be a matter of deciding what to use with that. Now you could go with the big, if I was using the lime green polka dots, I'd probably go, I mean, this would be a great option for down the front of the larger dress. I think it might have been too wide for the smaller one. Or there's also this wonderful sparkly rickrack. I mean, all little girls love sparkles, so that would have been a cute one to use with it. And that would have worked on either size. So you kind of have to look at things and then set aside ones that don't speak to you at the time. So after seeing the sparkly one, I wouldn't use that one. So that's one option. Another option would have been to use this funky little trim that I've got. And obviously you would cover that seam allowance. Let's see if I can do this. So that would be fun, and the pinks go well together. That would be a good option. Of course, there's also pink rickrack, which I have. I ended up using the Wright's Jumbo rickrack, and it did not have a color on it, so I'm guessing it would be lime green. I do like using the Wright brand. I can get a lot of different cotton rickracks from heirloom shops, but the problem with the cotton ones is once they're laundered, the little points tend to curl up, and with the Wright Jumbo rickrack or any of their rickracks, they're made from polyester, so they don't curl up. So that's something to think about when you're selecting your rickrack. Depends on who's getting it and if they iron. So I like these options with the lime green. If I was going with the pink, I might go with something that has a little more pink in it. And another option would have been to use the striped ribbon. And if I were to do that with the lime green stripes, I'd probably pick a pink rickrack because that stands out nicely. And then of course you can add your buttons if you've got buttons to go with it. You want things to pop as you look at them. You don't want it to look boring, and you don't want it all to be so matchy that it's all the same. Now another option with this would have been to use white rickrack. That shows up really well, and if I was using the pink, because it's got the white in it, I might think about pulling that one out. And another thing that you can do, if you've got the right kind of buttons, you can always stack buttons so that you get both colors showing. And again, now I don't think that necessarily adds a whole lot to this, but maybe if I was doing it on the pink ribbon, you can see where stacking the buttons would be a fun way to go. So this is kind of how I go about designing things. You know, the options are endless, and if you've got resources where you can purchase these things. Now see, I thought that one would work, but this pink is just too bright. It takes away from things. I've tried different buttons with these. I don't like the shiny ones, but if they were the only ones that matched and I wasn't going out, I would use those. If I had done this, I may have wanted to, if I was going with the lime green, you know, you can kind of think. Now I did add piping to the seam allowance, and if you want to see what that looks like, you just have to put a little bit of the piping underneath there to see if you think that would add to it, or do nothing for it. Now it might work with this lime green gingham. See, I like that together. So if had I chosen this to go with the ruffles, I probably still would have gone with the lime green piping. If I was using this for the ruffles, I don't think that's the route I would go. Piping is a nice, inexpensive way to add interest to a garment because that gives you so many more options. With the floral dress, I had trouble finding good options for coordinating fabrics and trims. So I ended up taking the gingham and making a lavender ruffle with that. However, you can always use fabric to make ruffles, to make trims, and if you wanted to have buttons and you couldn't match a button at all, you can always cover buttons with the fabric so that you've got an exact match. So there's always lots of alternatives if you can't come up with the right trim, or if it's midnight and you're still working on a dress for the next day and you need to get it done, then come up with plan B. So I hope this has helped you out, and I hope that you'll have some fun design. If you have a store that's got great fabrics near you, I would highly recommend going in and playing with the fabrics and trims there and laying things out. And once you've made a decision, then go home and create your little boutique April dress. If you have enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel.